Getting inside one of the most powerful, secretive companies on earth. I'm Dennis Berman of the Wall Street Journal, here with the big interview with my guest, Steve Coll, one of our greatest living journalists. I hope you'll take the mantle. He's written a new book. It's called Private Empire, and it's about ExxonMobil and its spread across the world and how it does business. Steve, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Dennis.
So, you spent a lot of time covering Exxon. Is it a force for good or force for evil?
It's a force, and it has lots of impacts in the world that are both constructive and destructive. Some of which are built just out of its very business model and structure and its influence in really weak states where it pumps oil and gas. Maybe not so much ExxonMobil's fault, but
right.
You know, the sort of structure of resource extraction in really poor countries is problematic. But it's also a really successful corporation. You know, you go back in American history, and it's hard to find a single corporation that has operated at the top of the American table for so long. I mean, I remember going back early in the research looking at the Fortune 500 lists from like 1950, and there they are, and all the other companies are gone. U.S. Steel, General Motors. Yeah.
So it seems that you've compiled so much information about the company. There are a few things, having read the book, that really stood out. One is the great character of Lee Raymond, the CEO who left a few years ago. I sense you have kind of a grudging respect for Mr. Raymond in that he was able, by bullying, by being quite difficult, but being in some ways visionary, really to push Exxon still forward. So would you describe him?
Yeah, he was a very effective chief executive, and even those who suffered under his unforgiving glare would say as much. But he led a very big corporation for a long time and changed it. And once you realize how intractable ExxonMobil is as a culture, as a company, almost any bureaucracy that size with such a solid business model that's unthreatened by competitors and so forth is going to be difficult to change. And he really changed the place after the Valdez. And that's one reason to be admiring of him. I think as a writer, you always love people who are comfortable in their own skin, who are not disingenuous or willing to lay it all out there, just be direct. And he's a larger-than-life figure and loomed that way in the industry. I think when he retired in 2005, his record sort of spoke for itself. He'd created a lot of value for ExxonMobil shareholders, and that was the measure by which he drove himself. So you kind of have to respect someone who achieves their own goals, even if other people around him might have taken a more balanced approach or perhaps been a little more forward-looking about environmental and climate issues. He was who he was, and he didn't apologize for it.
I think you have, at least reading between the lines, I think you view Rex Tillerson, his successor, a little less charitably. At least as you describe, he's very focused on his Boy Scout heritage, and you almost seem to suggest that that's almost a weakness, that he doesn't have the killer instinct of Lee Raymond.
Well, he came in to do something that's very hard for anyone to do at ExxonMobil, which is to communicate more effectively from the perch of a big oil company that nobody likes. And so this idea that by sheer force of sort of Boy Scout personality, he could turn the kind of position that ExxonMobil was in, I thought was a little naive, and I don't think it was very effective. Now, as a leader of the corporation, I think it's too early to judge his record as a business leader. He's only now starting to build departures from the strategy that he inherited, and he has a good team, and he certainly hasn't failed as chief executive. I think how much he is really able to shape ExxonMobil and what kind of legacy he leaves for shareholders is just a little early to say.
And there's that wonderful detail in the book when you describe him giving medals to employees, almost as if they were Boy Scouts, right? Merit badges. Looking at the personalities and perhaps maybe taking a step back from them, Private Empire is the name of the book, and you do get a sense of the company behaving as an extra-national institution, right? Working with governments when it's in its service,
to do so, right?
and certainly perhaps upsetting them when it's in its interest to do so that way. If you had to define the theme for what a private empire is. What is it?
Well, I think you described it. I mean, we live in a world where governments matter less and multinational corporations, relatively speaking, matter more. So do other non-state organizations. Human Rights Watch or the Red Cross matters more relatively on the global stage than it did 40 years ago. And so do terrorist networks. So that's kind of what drew me to the subject of a multinational. Now, within that sort of context, ExxonMobil is a particular case study because their business model is demanding in a way that, say, Google's or Walmart's or Apple's, other powerful multinational corporations today, because of their cash flow and their role in the information economy. ExxonMobil's business model is different. They drill holes in the ground all over the world, and then they sit on top of them for 40 years at a time. Now, that's a very strange geopolitical imperative. What you actually want when you do that as an independent sovereign is you want stability. So war and tumult and coups and changes of government are actually bad for them, and that's interesting.
And you're describing Exxon as an independent sovereign.
Yes, I am. I think they see themselves that way. I mean, I came into the project thinking, of course, the cliches about big oil companies can't be true, but what's the alternative? And gradually I came to think, well, the alternative is a kind of independent sovereignty in which they don't do the bidding of the Bush administration unless they find it in their interest and on their own watch. But what surprised me was discover that really they're pretty self-conscious about that themselves. That's actually the way they see themselves. It's not me imposing that view on them.
And there are moments in the book where I think in dealing with Putin in Russia, Putin's basically saying, well, get the Exxon to do what you want, U.S. government.
Right.
And U.S. government, we don't tell Exxon what to do. They tell us what
Bush
to do.
Bush literally says nobody tells those guys what to do. And there's this great scene where Raymond is talking to Putin in a one-on-one meeting at the stock exchange where he's thinking about buying a controlling share in Yukos, Khodorkovsky's company, in 2003. And Putin's kind of trying to get a grip on what it is that Raymond's telling him. And Raymond's saying, basically, I'm going to need to take control. And Putin says, well, does that mean that if I want to do anything with this big oil company, I'm going to have to come to you and ask permission? And Raymond says, yeah, that's not so bad. It's like that at a lot of places in the world.
Yeah, but not in Russia. And we see throughout the book and just in the oil industry generally, we see those tensions, right, between nation states, their natural resources, and independent companies. Generally speaking, the move has been more towards nationalized energy sources, and that's left few opportunities for companies like Exxon to really make the living they need to.
Right, and that's really important to the world that ExxonMobil lives in and to how they operate and see themselves. You know, on the one hand, the paradox is they're the largest and most influential oil company in the world that's not owned by a government, but that makes them still a relative weakling compared to state-owned companies. And also, the world has changed because of this nationalism around oil and resources. It started in the Middle East in the 70s. It spread lots of post-colonial countries.
It just spread to Argentina.
Just spread to Argentina, or it was revived there again. And who knows what that portends in Latin America and Brazil. But you know, this world in which you have to replace all the oil and gas you pump every year. So in ExxonMobil's case, that's like 1.5 billion barrels of oil equivalent. That's a lot to find. And in a world where many, many countries lock you out for nationalistic reasons, it means that you're driven in 2 or 3 different directions, all of which are very interesting. One is to really weak states like in Africa that are just too weak to do it themselves.
In the book, a country called Equatorial Guinea, which no one really knows about, but sits on one of the most valuable oil finds in the world.
Yeah, offshore, a tiny place, kind of a terrible place, but has a lot of oil. Wants to be the Kuwait of Africa. If it weren't for its dictator, it might get there. Chad, another benighted country, sort of a fourth world country with a pile of oil on this kind of stranded area. Angola, Nigeria, larger oil powers, you know, bigger but deeply troubled places. So you go to weak states. Then you go also into new technological frontiers where you can argue even to nationalistic governments, you need us because you can't drill in water this deep or in weather this cold. Yeah, and so that's another. So you end up with this risk profile. It's geopolitical risk. That is, you're in these unstable states disproportionately, and you're in places you wouldn't want to otherwise be. Why would ExxonMobil want to be in Chad if it didn't really need the reserves?
And yet we see these circumstances really push the company into making what might be viewed as, you know, moral choices, but that it is so resistant to making, right? you show throughout that the company wants to stand as far away from politics, as far away from judgment as it can. It has its contract.
Right.
It's going to stand behind iron fences, and it's going to do its thing, and whatever happens outside doesn't matter. But of course, what happens outside matters a lot.
Right.
And you saw that in Equatorial Guinea. You see it in Chad. You see it in the United States. It seems, amorality is a business need, but it also seems that the company, I think, loses a lot of credibility when it talks about doing the right thing, when in a lot of cases it just stands back and lets bad things happen.
Yeah, no, I mean, you got it. And the sort of tension that I came to understand or believe in was between all these risks, all this turmoil outside, political challenges, instability, environmental campaigners, opposition of all types. So this context of instability and risk, and then within the company, a real bias towards conservatism, uniform systems, amorality, something that's cold and engineered. So they're, on the one hand, they are like the world's greatest engineers, but their engineering skills just cannot by their nature adapt to all of the dimensions of risk that they're dealing with. And because of this problem of accessing enough resources to replace what they pump out and sell every year, they keep being driven into riskier environments, even though they would like to just live in a nice, peaceful, stable world where you could pump oil for 40 years at a time.
Do you think that a corporation is a person?
No. I mean, I think that a corporation has the status of a person under the law in some circumstances and settings, yes. But what's interesting about really trying to get a feel for what an institution like ExxonMobil is that it actually lacks the qualities of an individual. It is a structure of incentives and culture and teams and so forth, and it's a pretty extreme example of a closed system, because it's basically more like the Marine Corps than any other corporation I've ever encountered, and that everyone's there for life, and the people who rise to the top rise together in cohorts, and you don't come in from the outside to that company. But the quality of it obviously is informed by a lot of talented people, a lot of dedicated, hardworking people, but it doesn't have the characteristics of an individual. If anything, it sort of draws individuality out of its folks and creates a greater cause.
And yet we're seeing right now the question about, we saw it on the campaign trail, right, is a corporation a person? And from a legal perspective, U.S. law basically says yes. And it was this principle that was enshrined into law in the Citizens United case, which gave companies really sort of unfettered political speech. Watching how Exxon behaves politically and as an actor in our political realm, does the Citizens United decision make sense, or is there a unique characteristic about companies in business that should push them out of our political process?
Well, it's interesting to think about that, especially with a company like ExxonMobil, which has, as it often points out, 1 million plus shareholders, mutual fund retirees. Everybody who owns a mutual fund is likely to own a piece of ExxonMobil. Government pension funds, teacher retirement funds. So they're a very democratic with a small d organization, in that many Americans participate in owning them. And they have 80,000 employees. Most of them are not Americans. They're living abroad, but the employees in the United States contribute to a political action committee fund. But nobody but a handful of executives at the headquarters, at the God Pod or the Death Star, has a say in how that money is spent. So ExxonMobil undertakes a series of decisions that it's entitled to take under Citizens United and other legal regimes, which is it decides to spend 90% or more of its employees' political action committee contributions on Republican candidates. So more than any other corporation whose contributions I analyzed that had a politically active strategy. And now, under the law, they're entitled to do that. That is what leadership is elected to do, I suppose, to forge political strategies that are matched with the shareholders' interest as the leadership sees it. But this is, on the one hand, they want to argue for their status in our political system by pointing out that they're everybody. There are a lot of different people, little guys, and on the other hand, they want to make very narrow self-interested decisions that
Right.
have to do with the value of the shares by which they're compensated and so on. So I'm not sure what to make of all of that, but there's a lot of contradictions.
It doesn't seem that the super PAC behavior we're seeing in this election, it does not feel like a great flowering of democracy.
No, it doesn't, no. And I mean, in fairness, the super PACs are an even order of magnitude worse than what ExxonMobil does with its PAC. I mean, its PAC is at least transparent. It files its,
Right.
and it works at a certain level of spending compared to a single individual who can often shield a lot of his views and just dropping 5 or 10 million into the bucket. I mean, that's.
Do you get the sense that Exxon is the platonic ideal of a corporation? I mean, the way you describe it,
they're sort of the logical extension of a certain idea of a corporation.
Right.
They're a form of beauty, perfection within a certain realm. And then what's clarifying about that is you look at it and say, okay, I see the formal geometric achievement here, operating discipline, financial discipline, cultural coherence, lifelong employment, a real cohesion, and a philosophy that's consistent and applied over time systematically. Okay, so that's a kind of formal...
kind of like a beautiful ruthlessness.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And then you say, well, okay, so what's wrong with this picture? And I think that's an interesting discussion that we've been having, but
Right.
one of the questions is, what are its responsibilities beyond this formal shape? Does it really not have any other responsibilities or imperatives? What is leadership really about if you're in that position?
And so we'll get to the last two questions, and that is there a moral responsibility from a company that perhaps fulfills the letter of the law, fulfills its contracts, behaves honorably as in a business matter? Is there a higher moral duty?
Maybe not, but there's a business imperative to do better than they do, I would argue. Because basically, if you live in a world that's changing the way ours is, where young people are rising to authority faster than ever, where the world's more diverse and more interconnected than ever, where talent is more individualistic and more creative. You want to retain the best young scientists of the next generation? Can you really operate with the culture they have?
Right.
I think that the fundamental problem with their formal cold beauty is that it's actually self-defeating in the long run. They're going to have to adapt to the world that we actually live in and not stand apart
Right.
from it.
And last question, one thing I was struck by was how Lee Raymond says, I don't have a duty to the United States.
Yeah.
I have a duty to my shareholders. And I see that in so many different ways. In companies around Wall Street, my duty first is to my shareholders. Have we lost a sense of duty to the country? Is there a general ideal that my shareholders come first, my country comes maybe sixth
Right.
in the list?
I think if you talk to business leaders of the post-war era who really kind of came of age in the 60s and during the Cold War, they'll all say, yeah, absolutely. And maybe it's the end of the Cold War. Maybe it's the fact that there's no existential enemy and menace, no two competing systems that bind a corporation to national interest the same way. Maybe it's globalization and the fact that the whole structure of the world economy has dispersed these businesses in ways that have forced them to make these choices in ways that somebody in the 60s wouldn't recognize. Yeah. But it's definitely a loss of a certain social and political role that these corporations played in the 60s.
Right. Well, a beautiful ruthlessness. Indeed.
Yes, that's a nice phrase. Yeah.
Steve Coll, thank you so much for joining us. The book is Private Empire. When does it go on sale? Is it on sale
Right now.
Right now, okay.
In stores today.
In stores. Steve, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you for having me.